He was born into a prominent Philadelphia family on December 3rd, 1826. He entered West Point in the summer of 1842 at age 15, when the minimum age to enter West Point at the time was 16. He would graduate second in his class from the famous class of 1846, and because he graduated second, he would be chosen to serve in the elite Army Corps of Engineers. He graduated in time to serve in the Mexican War, where he was brevetted twice for bravery on the battlefield. After the Mexican War, he had a distinguished peacetime military career, but he would leave that all behind to become a very successful and very rich railroad executive. He would defeat future Confederate General A.P. Hill for the hand of the woman they both loved. When Civil War broke out, he volunteered his services for the Union Army. His victories in Western Virginia secured those counties for the Union Army. After the debacle that was First Bull Run, he was summoned to Washington to take command of the Army. Relieved of command not once, but twice, he would go on to run for President of the United States in 1864, where he would be defeated badly. Although his father was friends with Senator Daniel Webster, the famous abolitionist, he himself, a lifelong Democrat, was not an abolitionist. Today, we're going to take a look at my personal favorite Civil War general, George B. McClellan. And yes, you heard me correctly, my favorite Civil War general, Major General George B. McClellan. Hello and welcome back to my channel, Civil War Reports. I am your War of the Rebellion reporter, Brian Thomas Kopak, and today we're going to be taking a look at my favorite Civil War general, George B. McClellan. Now, when I came up with the idea and concept for Civil War Reports in late year 2021, I knew very early on that one of my first episodes would be on George McClellan. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's people out there right now scratching their heads wondering how anybody could find George McClellan to be their favorite Civil War general. And while I don't expect to convert anybody over to liking Little Mac, I do hope at the end of this episode you will at least see the general in a different light. So why is he my favorite Civil War general? Well, the answer to that question is as complex as the man himself, but I'll try to explain. One, the man was extremely intelligent. You don't graduate second in your class from West Point unless you're a very intelligent man. Unfortunately for McClellan, with his intelligence also came a certain level of arrogance that turned a lot of people off. Secondly, he was greatly devoted to his wife, something you don't see much in 21st century America anymore. And I'm also fascinated by the fact that he was very, very dedicated to his work, to the point where if he did not personally oversee every minute detail, it wasn't done right. At least for that second part, again, that's where the arrogance comes in. But for the first part, his extreme dedication, which he showed to his wife and to his work. And again, while I don't expect to make any converts out there, because I know George McClellan is an extremely controversial figure, again, I hope you'll see him in a different light. In this episode, in the opening scenes, you're going to see me in a different part of my house. I'm in front of what I like to call my shrine to McClellan. Yes, I am so fascinated with George McClellan that I've actually dedicated a wall in one of the rooms in my house as a shrine to Little Mac. So without any further ado, please enjoy this biographical sketch of Major General George B. McClellan. As mentioned in the introduction, McClellan was born on December 3rd, 1826 to a prominent Philadelphia family. His father was a physician, and McClellan was basically born with a silver spoon in his mouth. At an early age, he was privately tutored in mathematics and French, and he also established himself as a fine equestrian. All three would be very helpful in his future military career. When he entered West Point, he already had that base of mathematics and French. French was a required language at West Point at the time. While at West Point, he discovered he preferred the company of his Southern peers as opposed to his Northern classmates. He got along great with most of his Southern peers, except for Stonewall Jackson. Well, Thomas Jackson, future Stonewall Jackson. That's for another episode. McClellan and Jackson just didn't seem to get along too well because McClellan found him to be not nearly as sophisticated as some of his other Southern peers, which is also true. Jackson was from the western part of Virginia, and he was not part of the Virginia social elite. While at West Point, McClellan was president of the Dialectic Society, and he thought that would springboard him to the top spot of his class. When McClellan discovered he was going to have to settle for the number 2 spot, he got very upset and protested, and we could basically say that this was the birth, shall we say, of his military arrogance. Upon graduating from West Point, because he was second in his class, he was able to join the elite Army Corps of Engineers. He also graduated in time to go serve in the Mexican War. McClellan boasted that when he went to Mexico, he brought with him a double-barrel shotgun, 2 revolvers, a saber, a dress sword, and a Bowie knife. McClellan would come under fire while serving in Mexico, and he would be brevetted twice for bravery. Also there in Mexico, he would have the pleasure of serving under future Confederate generals such as Robert E. Lee, P.G.T. Beauregard, and Joe Johnson. We also saw during the Mexican War, McClellan developed a great liking for Brevet Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, and we also see McClellan developing his dislike for civilian authority. Although he would push out in the future Winfield Scott from his position as General-in-Chief, McClellan's position on civilians running military matters would not change. While McClellan developed his lack of love, shall we say, for civilian authorities during wartime, one thing McClellan could take away from his experience in Mexico was that he favored maneuver and siege tactics over direct assaults. He felt that the best way to win a war was to try to outmaneuver the enemy and then lay siege. This is what he learned during the Mexican War, and this would play a role in his thinking when he was commander of the Army of the Potomac during the American Civil War. Life as a soldier during peacetime between the Mexican War and the American Civil War could be both boring and promotions being few and far between. For McClellan, he definitely discovered the latter. By the time he would resign from the military in the late 1850s, he would only rise to the rank of captain. But his career was anything but boring. He was chosen to be the youngest of 3 American observers to go to Europe and witness the Crimean War. While he saw very little in the way of actual real fighting, he missed out on seeing how the rifled musket replaced the more now outdated smoothbore musket. He did get a chance to observe some of the fortifications that were built during that war. While in Europe, he also translated a French bayonet manual that would become used by the United States military. And also over there, he observed an Austrian saddle that he liked, and he redesigned, and that was also adopted by the U.S. military. In fact, would be used by the U.S. cavalry until that mounted wing was disbanded. And it would bear his name, the McClellan saddle. Also, during this antebellum period, he was chosen to try to map out a route for a future transcontinental railroad. And it was during this time that he met Ulysses S. Grant, who McClellan described as a drunkard, and that would come into play later on at the start of the American Civil War. On January 15, 1857, McClellan resigned his commission as a captain in the U.S. military to take up a career in railroading, where he became a very successful and very wealthy railroad executive for the Illinois Central Railroad. It was during this time that he met its lawyer, Abraham Lincoln. And in 1858, when Lincoln ran for the U.S. Senate seat for Illinois against Stephen Douglas, McClellan was more than happy to let Douglas travel from debate to debate in McClellan's personal railroad car. McClellan was a lifelong Democrat, and he did not have much respect for the self-educated Republican Lincoln. It was also during this time, as a railroad executive, that McClellan met the love of his life, Mary Ellen Marcy. McClellan knew Mary Ellen's father from the military, and the father approved of McClellan, but Mary Ellen rejected his first proposal of marriage. She would later go on to be courted by future Confederate General A.P. Hill, but it's very possible that her father, a military man, was aware of the gonorrhea that A.P. Hill contracted during his days at West Point, and he forbade the marriage. McClellan would meet Mary Ellen again, and he would propose marriage a second time. The second time, she accepted. They were married on May 22, 1860, and at the time, McClellan promised her 50 years of happiness. They would have just over 25 years before McClellan would pass away. Also, at the start of the American Civil War, McClellan, when he left his wife, he promised to write to her, or telegraph her, or both, every day that they were apart, and that was a promise that McClellan kept. And that is one thing I admire about the general. At the start of the American Civil War, McClellan volunteered his services for the Union Army. He was sought after by the states of New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio to take charge of their volunteers. McClellan would accept the Ohio position. It was also during this time that he was paid a visit by Ulysses S. Grant, hoping to gain a position on McClellan's staff. McClellan, remembering Grant from the days of the railroad expedition, basically refused to meet with him, and Grant would have to go find assignments elsewhere. It was also during this time that we start to see the beginnings of McClellan's Civil War thinking. Basically, you start to see his distaste for civilian authority, and wherever he was, that became the major focal point of a future Confederate attack. He took an inventory of the Ohio arsenal and was extremely disappointed at what he saw, and he began to demand nothing but the best equipment for his soldiers. His soldiers loved him and would nickname him Little Mac, and he loved his soldiers. The newspapers would go on to call him the Young Napoleon. When McClellan was ready, he took his army into Western Virginia, where he fought the first land battles of the American Civil War. The first one was at Philippi, West Virginia, well, what is now Philippi, West Virginia, at the time Philippi, Virginia, and it was a very small and minor engagement, but it was the first land battle of the Civil War and the first Union victory. He would go on to fight other battles in Western Virginia, which would be victorious for the Union Army. He'd fight at Rich Mountain and Laurel Hill, and he would become the North's first war hero. But we also see that he also developed a great distaste for his subordinates. And I quote, "I have not a brigadier general worth his salt. Morris is a timid old woman. Rosecrans a silly fussy goose. Schleich knows nothing." Now, the term timid old woman would be a phrase McClellan would use again and again throughout the Civil War. And as far as Rosecrans goes, well, basically Rosecrans won the Battle of Laurel Hill for McClellan. But it would be McClellan, as the Army commander, who would take credit, and he would become the first North war hero. And after the debacle that was First Bull Run, he would be summoned to come to Washington to take charge of what would be the Army of the Potomac. And this concludes part 1 of this episode. Check back again shortly for part 2 of my biographical sketch of Major General George B. McClellan.